is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. For much of the pandemic, the place we live and the people we live with has become our entire world. Almost 1 in 3 Americans lives in a doubled-up household, that is, with other adults who aren't their partner or college-age child. Today, Where We Live, we talk about sharing living spaces. Now, cost is a big factor in housing arrangements, but living with roommates also has social implications too. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you live with roommates or live in a multi-generational household? Join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. Last March, more than 81 million adults lived in a shared household. That's according to Pew Research Center. Where We Live producer Carmen Baskoff is one of them. She sat down with her roommate Luke to talk about their living situation.
You're, in your late 20s. I'm also in my late 20s, and we're both adults living with roommates. Why did you want to keep living with roommates as a young person?
I think there are a couple things that are good about living with roommates. I mean, number one, of course, is just how more affordable it makes living. Splitting the cost of rent by 3 can just go such a long way.
And I think also, the social part of it is a big thing for me, too. I think I'm definitely very introverted. I think if I was, left to my own devices, living by myself, I would become a hermit and never interact with anyone. So, yeah, I feel like we have a really fun household.
I think so too. I think I'm the same way. I'm also, and maybe this is embarrassing to say on public radio, but I feel like living with other people encourages me to better life habits like tidiness and more regular meals and bedtime and outside time. And I feel like, especially over the past year and a half or so that we've been living together in the pandemic, I remember partway through just thinking about what it would be like to not have anyone that you're living with and not being able to actually have any physical contact.
Yeah, I feel like it's really been a lifesaver this last year and a half. Okay, well, Luke, sadly, we are going to be
no longer roommates
soon. No. But you're going to keep living in New Haven, and you're moving to a new place, and you were trying to think about what type of housing situation you want to be in. What did you end up deciding to do?
Yeah, so I'm moving into another apartment with other roommates. I feel like even in our social circle, it does seem there's a transition when people either they find a long-term partner that they want to move in with, or if they moved in with their parents. But my parents live out of state, and although I am happy to be seeing someone, we just weren't ready to move in yet, and so the roommate situation just seemed like, okay, let's do this again. I mean, it's been such a good fit for the last 2 years, so.
Well, I will miss very much being your roommate.
Me too.
You're listening to Where We Live. They sound like they're pretty good roommates. We all have good roommate stories and bad roommate stories. But today we're talking about shared households and the trends that we're seeing. Joining us on Zoom right now is Kim Velsey. She's a reporter for New York Magazine's real estate and design website, Curbed. Kim, welcome to our show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So in your real estate reporting, you cover the rental market in New York, especially in this last year and a half. And so does that resonate with you when you heard Carmen and Luke talking about, the factors that lead them to living with other people?
Yes, definitely. I think when I started talking to people at the beginning of the pandemic, many people were sort of worried about having, people they didn't know coming into their spaces. But within a few months, the thing that I was hearing most was that people were looking for companionship with their roommates. It was one of the few sorts of relationships that you could have that felt very normal. And, people, I even heard from people who were moving in from studio apartments to live together because they were so lonely during the pandemic.
When we think about doubled up households, both Luke and Carmen mentioned that it does save them money, I would think, especially in a place like New York City, but even smaller cities like New Haven and Stamford, Kim.
Yes, I think that something, it's very expensive to live alone, and it also is there are expenses and effort and time associated with making all of your own food and not sharing any domestic duties. Paying for internet or water or electricity bills all yourself is much more expensive. And there's also often in many cities like New York, there's not enough housing, like studio apartments for single people. A third of all households are single family house or single person households. And the housing stock doesn't really reflect that. So I think aside from the fact that many people do like the companionship of living with roommates, what we have in terms of housing doesn't really reflect the types of households that we have.
And we're going to be talking more about that here on Where We Live. You can join us too if you want to talk about your living arrangement, especially in this last year and a half. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Kim, we heard from Sean Gio from the Partnership for Stronger Communities sharing that there was a recent report from the National Low Income Housing Coalition that shows a Connecticut resident would have to work 91 hours a week to be able to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment.
Yes, I think something that is interesting there's been a lot of sort of conversation when we talk about co-living and the rise of co-living companies and people sort of opting into communal households. But the reality is that across the country, people who are lower income have been living in these types of households, not necessarily by choice, but by necessity. For a long time now. It's not necessarily the norm to be able to afford your own space. And you see a lot of people sharing spaces and multi-generational households in a lot of parts of the country and increasingly everywhere because housing prices are sort of out of control, especially as we're coming out of the pandemic.
For so long, we've heard how expensive it is to live in New York City. But in the pandemic, what did you see in the rental market in terms of cost, Kim?
Well, I think at first it came down and people were able to get some deals. I did hear from people who, were able to make the move from Brooklyn to Manhattan or find better apartments or sort of move into a neighborhood that they'd long sort of, wanted to take up residence in. But it was pretty short-lived. And now prices are going back up. We've even heard about like bidding wars for rental apartments. So I think that there was like this sort of hope for some time among renters in New York City that the pandemic sort of might make a lot of things possible that it hadn't before. But it seems like more than anything, we're going back to normal, and the normal is sort of unaffordable rents for many people.
So when we're looking at a traditional studio apartment and then comparing that with, say, a larger setup with multiple apartments, what happened with cost there, Kim?
During the pandemic, studio apartments were sort of the best deal around because a lot of people didn't want to be living alone. You would see places, especially in Manhattan, especially on the Upper East Side, where there's a lot of that type of housing stock for under $1,500 a month, which is a good deal for New York. But, I think that, basically that sort of is all shifting at this point, and there's not really many sort of good deals left to be found anymore.
You're hearing Kim Velsey here on Where We Live. She's a reporter for New York Magazine's real estate and design website, Curbed, talking about the factors that lead people to double up, to have roommates. Obviously, cost is a big factor. But in this pandemic, Kim, you touched on this earlier, just the social implications of not wanting to be alone and the benefits of having a roommate.
I think that a lot of people, yes, definitely a lot of people have talked about wanting that experience. And I think part of what is difficult in a place like New York City, especially because we have such small apartments and even 2 and 3 bedroom apartments aren't often very large in terms of square feet, is that people don't always sort of know how to go about living with other people or finding roommates, or they can be concerned that it might be difficult as they get older. Even though people do want this experience, it isn't only about cost.
I wanted to bring in another voice. Jennifer Molinsky is a senior research associate at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. Jen, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we've been focusing on city living and what Kim and others have experienced living in cities with roommates. But when we think about these trends in adults having in a shared household, they may or may not even be related to each other. What trends have you been paying attention to?
I think three main trends. One is this increase in multi-generational households where extended family are living together in the same home. It's typically at least two adult generations plus maybe the grandkids or grandparents raising grandkids. We've seen a lot of increase in that. 20% of people in the United States are living in some kind of multi-generational household. But we've also seen this increase in intentional communities such as co-living, in which a group of people are coming together to form a community. Typically, everyone has their own unit, their own house, but there's a lot of shared facilities and shared activity. And then we do have the non-family households, the roommates, as you say, and we haven't seen that. The share of households hasn't varied too much, but we do see this getting a lot more attention, and especially among older adults. I think there's this interest in living together for social reasons, for economic reasons, and also for mutual support and aid. There's different models where young people, maybe a graduate student, is living with an older adult and can provide some chores and tasks in exchange for reduced rent.
I'm glad you brought that up, Jen. Kim, you did a story about a woman in Maine. I think she was in her mid-60s, and she decided that one day she wanted to fulfill a dream she had of living in the city. And so how did she go about finding a roommate? It wasn't a typical someone in her age group.
Right. So she realized that she rented her house in Maine, and she'd always wanted to move to New York. She realized she couldn't afford to live alone, and I think many of her family members and friends were sort of doubtful that she would have an easy time finding a roommate because of her age. But she went on the Steens Project, and she was able to find someone who she really connected with. They both sort of did their own thing a lot of the time in the apartment. They weren't spending every second together. But she said she was pleasantly surprised by how receptive people who were in their 20s or 30s were to living with someone who was older than them.
Mm. Jen, when we were talking about trends earlier, how much of what we're seeing in terms of shared household relates to the fact that Americans are getting married much later than they did 50 years ago?
Yeah, I think that's right. When I look at multi-generational households, that's the family living together in one home. We really saw it bottom out in the 1980-ish time period. So, we have a long tradition of multi-generational households, but it kind of peaked and then declined into the latter half of the 20th century. But since then, it's been pulled up. And I think that marrying later, more single parent households where the single parent could benefit from the help of the older generation raising the children, those two trends have been really important. Another one has been population diversity, because Hispanic and Asian families are more likely to live multi-generationally because of cultural traditions or economic imperatives. So as the country has become more diverse and likely, as we continue down in that direction, we'll see more multi-generational households. And then, of course, economics. We saw a lot of multi-generational households form during the recession. But it's interesting because coming out of the recession, that growth has slowed, but it's still on an upward trajectory. We're still seeing more and more people of the same family deciding to live together. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens post-pandemic, if that changed the equation about where older people want to live or where our younger people hope their parents might live in older age.
When we're talking about older Americans, Jen, this question of them living longer and thinking about, suitable housing for them, the idea that, as people age, like maybe assisted living isn't what they want, but they still want to be part of a community. And so does it spur the question for all of us about, how we live with these multiple generations and not, thinking that there's a particular type of housing that's right for them?
Yeah, I very much agree. I think, the fastest growing age group in this country is those 80 and over. And that's also the group that's most likely to live alone. So 57% of people over 80 live alone. So I think it's, for some people that may be a choice and a preference. For others, though, it may be something that they would prefer not to do. So I think it's really important that we have these options of intentional communities or living with family or living with roommates. I think it just, there's no one size fits all solution. So we need to support all of these options.
Something else that's interesting before the pandemic, we heard from, about older Americans and the idea that living alone is not good for their health and general well-being. And then we find out in a pandemic, it's not good for any of us, Jen.
Right.
And just this idea about, what makes a community and the importance of companionship. Where you're located, are you seeing towns and neighborhoods thinking about this more thoughtfully?
I definitely think isolation has become, and loneliness have become much more, the awareness of them has grown during the pandemic as we've all experienced it. And I hope that empathy that we, that our own experiences will allow us to continue to think about people who have been living alone, before the pandemic and may not have many choices. So yes, I think there's a huge amount of programming out there that is designed to address isolation for people who are living alone, or even people living in senior housing who couldn't get out and about and mingle with their neighbors during the pandemic. And I hope that filters into us supporting more housing opportunities for people, because a lot of these solutions we're talking about, don't fit in a typical single family house. They might need a bigger house. They might need an apartment building or a campus-like setting for these intentional communities, the co-living. So there's a lot that I think we can do to support the actual construction of the physical housing for people to live in these different ways.
And how all that relates to zoning in local towns and cities. We're going to be talking about that coming up here on Where We Live. But my guest right now, Jennifer Molinsky, a senior research associate at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, and Kim Velsey, she's a reporter for New York Magazine's real estate and design website, Curbed. We'll continue talking right after the break, and we want to hear from you. You can join us. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. At one point or another, most of us have lived with roommates, but isn't there more to it than lowering housing costs? What has this last year and a half in a pandemic showed us about the benefits of shared living? Now, doubling up or living with people in a shared household has increased over the past 40 years. That information from Pew Research Center. We're talking about this with my guest today on Zoom, Kim Velsey, reporter for New York Magazine's real estate and design website, Curbed. She also worked for the Hartford Courant back in the day. So nice to talk with you today, Kim. And Jennifer Molinsky's here, a senior research associate at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. Jen, I wanted to go back to you because we touched on multi-generational communities in the last segment. But when we think about doubled up households, this idea that there's more than one adult, they may not be related, but just the idea that more people are feeling comfortable and have a need to have a shared household with more than one adult. Can you talk more about the people we're talking about?
Sure. I mean, among the older population, which is 65 and over, about 1 million people are living in these unrelated, roommate situations, or maybe perhaps one is a homeowner and the other person is a boarder. And that's been growing. It was just, it's a small percentage of the older population. But it's one that I think we have to pay attention to. So it's definitely been growing over the past couple of decades. And I think it really has a lot to do with the companionship. I've read about people feeling an increased sense of safety having somebody else in the home. So if something should happen, there's somebody there. and then that support, that mutual support. So I think this is a trend that's occurring across racial and ethnic groups too, which is an interesting thing because there are such differences in, say, the multi-generational households by race and ethnicity.
And are we hearing or seeing that more parents are moving in with their adult children, Jen?
Yeah, it goes both ways. So sometimes it's the adult children moving into the parents' household. Other times it's the older generation moving into the adult children's household. So, and I think that the difference is the older the person gets, the more likely they're in their child's house. But it breaks out both ways.
When I moved to Connecticut, the first time we were looking to buy a home, there were a few places that advertised, we have in-law apartments, and I never actually really heard of that before. Can you talk about that type of housing, the fact that you could have, a part of your home that may be for your mom or dad, that they still need some space, from your rowdy family and your young kids?
Yeah, so sometimes they're called accessory dwelling units. Sometimes they're called in-law apartments. So this could be a suite or an apartment carved out within the main home, or it could be sort of a cottage-like thing that is in the backyard or the side yard where someone could live. I think this is a really interesting trend, and we're seeing a lot more of it. We're seeing a lot of states trying to facilitate the ability of homeowners to do this kind of thing, because it typically provides lower cost housing, but it also provides these options, these flexible options for families over the life cycle. So it could be that the in-law apartment is actually occupied by an adult child, back from college, but not yet sort of out fully on their own. It could be for in-laws. It could be for a caregiver. So definitely something that we're watching, that a lot of communities and states, as I said, are thinking about how to change zoning laws to facilitate these, because they really are important on so many fronts.
We should mention that in the last legislative session here in Connecticut, that accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, passed, and this requires towns to allow single-family homeowners to convert parts of their dwellings or detached garages into so-called accessory dwelling units. But in Connecticut, towns can still vote to opt out. I think that's interesting. What we've seen is tension in communities that, don't want to move away from that single-family neighborhood, Jen.
Yes, that's right. I think there's always some concern about privacy, about additional cars, about increased density, even if it's in this form, even if it's in the form of there's actually no new building, it's part of the existing structure. So I think those are issues that are common to a lot of moves to increase housing options, unfortunately.
And it speaks to what people think of in the traditional sense of what is a nuclear family, right? That people should be blood relatives versus random adults living together.
Right. That's a big issue. And I know you'll get to this later in the program, but that zoning often prohibits a number of unrelated people from living together.
Kim Velsey, you're still with us. And I wanted to go back to you because we just mentioned briefly about co-living. You've written a lot about these trends. And how is that different from, what we're seeing in traditional communities that, have places where people can rent and have roommates?
Right. Well, co-living became popular about a decade ago, where you had a lot of companies who basically try to come in and do what people had been doing informally forever with roommates. And they, sort of basically package together the rooms with like other services like housekeeping and household supplies that are supposed to sort of take the tension out of the roommate relationship. And I think what was interesting in cities like New York was that these things were popular because there had long been a need for, something like a boarding house or a rooming house for somebody who was moving to the city, who didn't have any contacts or connections, could find a place and, not get sort of scammed off Craigslist or, not worry about their roommates being untrustworthy, and find housing in that way. And, many of them were sort of less of the sort of utopian communal nature and sort of more just of a very practical type of housing. And, there are still a few types of sort of women's boarding houses that are left in New York City from, 100 years ago. I feel like in many ways, these new co-living spaces sort of were offering the same service as those where, it was, you don't know anyone, here's a safe way you can sort of move to New York City.
That's interesting. Jen, you've looked at co-living outside cities. What have you found?
Right. So I think there's also this form of co-living that is created by the actual residents. So people coming together to form this community where there may be something that ties people together, such as a desire to live in an eco-friendly way or a desire to have multi-generational or intergenerational experiences. And so there's sort of a goal or a mission of the community. And we've definitely seen these picking up in the United States. There's a lot of models in Europe, and they're of great interest to people who are studying aging because, these are reaching out to a lot of older people who want to live on their own, but in community. So there's a little bit of both.
It's interesting when people hear about co-living or intentional communities, they might have in their minds, back in the 60s, no disrespect to anyone, but this idea of hippies living together. But now it's that definition is changing.
Well, yeah, I think the communities vary so much. We're doing some research now looking at multi-generational intentional communities in Germany where there's some public support for these things. And they're very different. The ones that we've seen, the building is entirely different. One is in an old school, one is in, a rehab department, one is in a completely slick, modern new building. And so the feel of them are different. The things that draw people together are different. So I think, you probably could find some that hark back to the 60s, but you'll find a lot that, speak to other interests and other kind of communities as well.
There's also an intentional community, I believe, in Western Mass that you could talk about. Could you tell us how that one works?
Yeah, the Treehouse community is a really interesting one in which it was created to support families adopting children out of the foster care system. So the community is comprised of the families, the kids, and older adults who live in their own apartments, usually lower cost housing, but they're there to provide support to those families. So it really is a village raising the kids. And there's a ton of community activities and people are really invested in each other's lives. So that's a really interesting one. There's also different models of housing for grandparents raising grandchildren because the needs of that population is a bit different, and older adults have certain needs, as do kids, and so bringing together some supports for all those people in one building is another trend we're seeing.
We wanted to hear from our listeners about shared housing arrangements. Eliana is calling in. Eliana, what's been your experience? Eliana, can you hear us?
I can now. Yes. Hello.
Yes. Hello. So what's been your experience with shared living? What's been your experience with shared living?
Great. Yeah. Thanks for the question. So I live in Washington, D.C., and I've lived here for about 8 years in cooperative living situations, anywhere from 4 to 13 people. And I actually recently just bought a house, just this week, actually. And I'm looking to have a cooperative living situation there, me and my partner and a few other roommates. And I'm just reflecting on my experiences actually trying to find a house for a number of unrelated people. And we tried several times when we first moved into the house that we live in now, encountering landlords who were skeptical of a group of people who were unrelated. And even when I was looking to buy homeowners insurance for my new house, I was told that I would need a different type of homeowners insurance policy if I were to have people living in the house who are not related to me. And so my question is, I would love to hear folks reflect more on some of the barriers to, I guess, what people have called sort of non-traditional group living settings in cities, and maybe some of the places that are looking to sort of dismantle those. And yeah, I'm thinking about in a home, we share a kitchen, we share a common space, and we each have our own bedroom. But I know that there's some places that really, some of the systems are not really set up to put up with that, I guess. So would love to hear some reflections about that.
Yes, and thank you, Eliana. It's actually a good transition because we wanted to bring up a case that happened in the West End of Hartford. Kim, you know about this. This was as Eliana mentioned, a group of families, no one related and outside of the families, but they wanted to live together. And there were some issues within the city of Hartford where they were told that they couldn't do that.
Yes, I think it was a sort of fascinating case where it was several families, I believe, who had purchased the house together, and it was a large house. There was certainly more than enough room for everyone who was living there, but they were challenged on the fact that they were unrelated people living together. And I think one of the things that's complicated is that often when you're sort of outside of cities, neighbors and town zonings, they challenge, people sharing a house. And then, when you sort of go within cities, housing prices are often so expensive that people can't afford to do something like that. So in New York, it would be very difficult to buy a townhouse with, several other families. Where it wouldn't be as, challenging, your neighbors wouldn't be as likely to complain. But it's definitely difficult to set up these households, I think. And, personally living in New York, I lived with roommates for years, and I've wondered, if there was any way to find the situation like that again. And it's very difficult. I don't know how you would do it here.
Eliana, to add some more info to this particular case in Hartford, again, this was a 10-bedroom house, and these several couples with children wanted to live in this house. They ended up going to court because they wanted to live together, and it was zoned for single family. Ultimately, the city dropped the case, and they're still living together. So there are examples of where this is permitted, even though it was a big fight. I wanted to go back to you, Jen Malinsky, because when we think about, say New England, where we've got a lot of older housing stock, some of these mansions where it makes sense that one family can't really live in a house like this, and why not have some flexibility where people can live within this house and not be beholden to these old zoning codes.
Right. There are often prohibitions against, carving up an old house for apartments, that would violate certain aspects of zoning or building codes. So that's definitely something that I think is a barrier we could, think about removing. It's also tough to access financing for some of these things, as Eliana may have experienced, getting a mortgage, or if you want to build an accessory dwelling unit, sometimes those aren't cheap. But if it's not going to be an income producing property, you could run into things with trying to finance that. So I think what we're seeing on the positive side is efforts to, recognition, first of all, that this is a growing phenomenon and people want to live together and we need to rethink these things. And then on things like ADUs, we're seeing some movement where companies are trying to make it easier to build these things. There's prefab versions, there's, different experiments with financing. So I think we're getting there, but it's definitely kind of undoing the old way of thinking.
And I wanted to end with you, Jen Malinsky, because we've been talking about the trend of people doubling up or having shared households. But when we think about the research you're doing, a lot of people still live alone, and they maybe speaks to the fact that we need to have more options for people.
Absolutely. I think, the biggest group, as I said, of older adults are those that live alone. And it's a big category across all age groups for sure. So I think, as I said before, for many people, this is a preference, but for many, it may not be. And so I just think what we've been talking about here is housing that needs to be more flexible. We might need flexible floor plans or accessory dwelling units. We might need to think about those big old houses. We might need to think about the kind of land that an intentional community might need, and how to place these things too, so that a big thing for me is that they're part of a community. They're not sort of tucked away, so that if we're building housing for, older adults or an older adult community, that it's very connected to the community. So I think there's no one size fits all in any of these, any solutions. There's no one size fits all for older adults or for any age group. So we just need to think very broadly about housing options.
Jennifer Malinsky, again, is Senior Research Associate at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. Jen, thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And it was good to hear from Kim Velsey, a former Hartford Courant reporter, now reporting for New York Magazine's real estate and design website Curbed. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. After the break, we're going to talk about how traditional zoning laws affect living arrangements. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. Joining us now on Zoom is Devin Michelle Bunton, Assistant Professor of Urban Economics and Housing at MIT. Devin, welcome to our show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So we've been talking about what leads people to share living spaces and the types of arrangements, but we've got to talk about housing. And so can you give us a little history of when single-family zoning laws first started appearing?
Yeah, so single-family zoning laws first started appearing, I think, in Berkeley, California in 1916 was the first sort of comprehensive plan. And the way that these plans, that these zones worked is that they took the whole city and they divided it up into separate spaces where different types of uses were allowed. And on the one hand, we think of sort of industrial factories that should have their own zone, and it's hard to disagree with that when they're spewing pollutants into the air. But there are also separate residential zones for apartments, and then single-family homes zones. And the single-family zones are spaces where you can only have one home per lot, and you cannot build even a duplex or a New England, a triple-decker. You can't build anything like that, just a single-family zone.
Mm-hmm. And before single-family zones really became popular, they were preceded by racial zoning laws, Devin?
Yes, that's right. So a little bit earlier, in 1911, the first racial zoning laws came into being in places like Louisville, Baltimore, and a large number of other cities, mostly in the South, had laws that in one way or another declared that a particular block or part of the city was only available to Black families or only available to white families. And this, I think, shows the sort of social control pretty front and center that zoning is really trying to implement. And those explicitly racist zoning laws were declared unconstitutional within a few years by the Supreme Court. And those cities went back to their books and, in many cases, more or less just changed the labels on the map so that places that were white neighborhoods became single-family zones, and places that had been Black neighborhoods became multifamily or even commercial or industrial zones.
And then even looking back to city life, more than a century ago, can you talk through some of what were common housing arrangements? I mean, people were living in hotels back then, right?
Yeah, people were living in hotels, and there were a wide variety of ways of living at the time. And in the era before zoning laws, which really have this social control fees, there was a lot of rapid change in cities, and even within particular homes. So you might have seen, on the one hand, some of these new mansions. Like the one that the Scarborough 11 tried to move into, that would have a family and then would later on have multiple families or maybe have boarders. Those single families would often have servants living within them, especially in those sort of large mansions. And then on the other hand, you'd have a large fraction of people living in residential hotels, which are, the sort of spaces where a lot of that have been making a comeback recently in some ways, but there's a lot of the sort of everyday boarding is taken care of. Maybe there's a shared cafeteria or other meal opportunities, and individuals have a room or perhaps a couple of bedrooms of their own, and just get to live in the city. And this at the time was a really big evolution for the types of living arrangements that people could have in these growing urban areas that enabled women to have a place to live alone that was not with either their parents or with their spouse. And it enabled a freedom there to pursue work, to pursue different types of relationships. And they were viewed as a threat, especially after the era of zoning. These sorts of places were viewed as a threat. And it's not hard to see why when we look at the history. These ended up becoming spaces where the anonymity of renting a single room enabled people to really explore different ways of living. And so these were some of the earliest queer neighborhoods grew around these because gay and lesbian couples were able to live together and pose perhaps as roommates, or at least have the ability to do so. And queer life really started growing around these in places like Times Square in New York and Tower Town, historic neighborhood sort of downtown Chicago.
Now, you and your colleagues have written about the social implications of zoning rules on the LGBT community. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this really comes down to understanding the single family zoning says something about the type of house that's available to build on a space. It's a house rather than, an apartment building. But it also says something about the type of family that's able to live in that house. And so both of those are sort of baked into zoning laws. And so a zoning law that says a single family, also somewhere in that law is going to define what does a family mean. And this is the law that those families in Hartford ran into, where different cities and different states have taken different approaches over time, but they have historically had the right to define families not quite as restrictively as they might want to, but fairly restrictively. The one thing that they have not been able to do is they've not been able to ban non-traditional, non-normative blood families. So if a grandmother is raising her grandchildren, that's allowed. But today still, two states, Michigan and Mississippi, have bans on straight couples living together if they're not married. And those are not really enforced, but that's the kind of degree of control that they allow. And so if a state or city wants to, and many of them have historically, not recognized a queer family as a family, they've fully been able to do so and prevent such couples from trying to move in.
So when we think about zoning laws defining who is or is not part of a family, are they more restrictive than, would you say, other parts of the legal system when they consider what a family is, Devin?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So in my own work, I have not researched this, but I have cited the legal scholar Kate Redburn, whose work on this is really fantastic. And in their work, they contrast the functional family definition that's really common in family law. And in this version of family definition, people don't have to be married. They don't have to have a blood relationship. They don't have to have a formal legal adoption. What they have to do is they have to show meaningful family commitments, the types of loving bonds that people are able to form in a variety of situations. And if they do show that, then they are entitled to all the obligations and the benefits that family law provides to families. And one of the key things that legal framework looks at is whether or not you live together. And so families are people who live together and are sort of intentionally creating a family. Unfortunately, zoning law is not nearly so friendly. Zoning law has stuck with the formal family definition, where it's spelled out pretty specifically that things like a family is a married couple living with children or other blood relatives. And so many states across the country, many communities across the country have laws that say only two unrelated people can live together, or maybe only three. And, so many of us have broken these laws. I've broken these laws. I first got learning about housing policy in Boulder, Colorado, when I lived with four people. And two of them were dating, and they shared a room, but they weren't married yet. And so we were living illegally at the time. I think that we had a cover story that me and the other brunette were sisters, but it never came up in the end, but it could have, and we would have, been subject to eviction because of the types of our relationship statuses.
You mentioned earlier Kate's research, the idea of a functional family versus a formal family. But before we run out of time, when we talk about queerness, the idea of chosen families or found families.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that this is this issue of formal zoning is one that cuts across a variety of different communities, and I think Kim and Jen have detailed some of the different ways that this shows up for different people with different commitments. For queer people and trans people, it's something that's particularly common because we are much more likely to end up having conflict with our birth families, with our formal families, because many of them are not interested in loving us the way that we are. And so you see this show up in queer and teen youth who are much more likely to be homeless than straight youth. And that sort of family estrangement continues to be common. And so it's far more likely, but definitely more likely that queer and trans people are going to be looking for those connections outside of formal families and are going to be disproportionately affected by the types of laws that prohibit or that make it difficult to use a functional family as your family, and in some neighborhoods and in some cities.
Connecticut's often called the land of steady habits, but when we're thinking about zoning and the fact that, a lot more, there should be more different housing arrangements permitted, Devin, do you see any movement, any models where neighborhoods or communities are uncoupling this definition of family from residential limits?
Yeah, so there are, I think, 4 states, I think California and New York among them, maybe not Connecticut yet, though. California, New York, New Jersey, and Michigan that have these sorts of families are, by definition, brought into the fold. That, if you're a single housekeeping unit, I think is the definition California uses, where, the Scarborough 11 would certainly qualify. That's the whole point, is to be able to live together, cook together, clean together, have life together. Then you're allowed. And so there are 4 states where that's explicitly allowed. And they have not chose to ban it. And, Connecticut, in giving up the fight against the Scarborough 11, has, hopefully started to take a step down that direction. And I think that, that Kate's work, they really show how natural this evolution really is, that so much of state and federal law is really about supporting these sorts of functional families. And so it's just hopefully a matter of time before zoning law comes along.
We'll see here in Connecticut, but really interesting conversation with you. Devin Michelle Bunting, Assistant Professor of Urban Economics and Housing at MIT. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Carmen Baskoff. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. We'll be back tomorrow.